Good evening. You are on the Dream History channel. You can slow down a little now, get comfortable, and take a calm breath. Tonight's story is How Ordinary People Lived in Scandinavia Before the Vikings. You may take a slow breath and allow the world to arrive without effort, because nothing in this place ever arrives suddenly. Long before ships crossed open seas, long before names were remembered or stories written down, long before anyone imagined Scandinavia as a land of warriors or raids, life here unfolded quietly across forests, stone, and water, without spectacle, without ambition, and without any sense that it would one day be called an age at all. There were no towns gathered behind walls, no streets carrying constant movement, no centers where people assembled to feel part of something larger than themselves, only scattered households placed where the land allowed them to exist, each separated by distance, terrain, and silence. The northern landscape did not permit closeness because forests claimed most of the ground. Rock broke through thin soil wherever it pleased, and water settled stubbornly in low places, refusing to drain, making each usable patch of earth rare enough that it had to be claimed carefully, cleared slowly, and protected across generations. Because of this, people lived apart, not out of preference or solitude, but because survival demanded space, space for fields that barely produced enough, space for animals that needed grazing, space for wood that would one day become heat, tools, and shelter. A single farm stood on a rise cleared of stone by hand, shaped by years of repeated effort, while another farm existed far beyond it, unseen and unreachable except by narrow paths worn into the land through constant use, paths that most people would walk for their entire lives without ever wondering where else they might lead. There were no written boundaries to these lands, no documents to prove ownership, because land was held through memory, inheritance, and continuous work, and losing it did not mean inconvenience, but the slow collapse of a family's future. Life here was not organized around improvement or expansion, but around continuation, around doing enough today so that tomorrow could exist in the same shape. Winter governed everything, arriving early and leaving reluctantly, pressing cold into the ground and holding it there, covering familiar paths with snow, slowing movement until every action became deliberate, and shortening daylight until the day itself felt fragile and easily lost. During these months, stored grain revealed whether planning had been sufficient, animals revealed whether fodder had been enough, and mistakes made in summer returned not as lessons, but as hunger, weakness, and loss. When summer finally returned, it did not bring rest, because the light lingered in the sky for long hours, refusing to fade, and work stretched late into the evening as fields were tended, grass was cut and dried, wood was gathered and stacked, roofs repaired, tools sharpened, and every possible preparation made before winter could announce itself again. Time was never counted here because it did not need to be. It was felt through cold hands, tired backs, and the length of shadows, through the urgency of summer and the restraint of winter, through the body rather than the mind. Most people never traveled far because movement beyond necessity wasted energy, and energy was always limited. So the world they knew remained defined by walking distance, seasonal routes, and the memory of previous years. Within this narrow range, knowledge became exact and deeply practical, as people learned which slopes thawed first in spring, where frost lingered longest, which fields failed more often than others, and which animals weakened earliest when winter tightened its grip. This knowledge was never written down because it lived in people, and when people died, knowledge often died with them, making survival a shared responsibility that bound households together across generations. Homes reflected this reality completely. If life in this northern world appeared quiet, it was only because the land itself demanded restraint, because nothing here could be rushed without consequence, and nowhere was this more visible than in the way climate governed every choice long before any human decision could matter. Cold was not an event, but a condition, settling into the year early and leaving late, pressing itself into soil, wood, and bone, shaping not only how people lived, but how they thought, because survival depended less on strength than on anticipation. Winters arrived gradually, yet unmistakably, as daylight shortened day by day until work itself had to be compressed into narrow windows of visibility, forcing tasks to be chosen carefully, not by preference but by necessity, because unfinished work simply carried forward into hardship. During these months, darkness dominated the rhythm of life, not dramatically but persistently, reducing movement, limiting travel, and narrowing attention inward toward the household, the fire, the animals, and the stored food that represented the outcome of every previous season's effort. Light, when it returned, did so unevenly, expanding quickly in spring and stretching into long summer days that seemed to resist night entirely, creating a brief period where time felt abundant and exhaustion became secondary to opportunity. In these weeks, work expanded to fill every available hour, because summer offered no forgiveness, and every task delayed risked becoming impossible once frost returned, turning preparation into urgency, and urgency into habit. The land itself imposed constant limitation. Soil was thin, broken by stone, and uneven, requiring careful selection of fields and repeated maintenance, because fertile ground did not naturally renew itself without attention, manure, ash, and rotation, all applied slowly through accumulated experience rather than experimentation. Farming was therefore not expansive but conservative, focused on maintaining what already existed, rather than pushing boundaries that could not be defended against weather. Barley, oats, and rye became staples not because they were preferred, but because they tolerated cold, matured quickly, and failed less catastrophically than other crops, making reliability more valuable than abundance. Even so, harvests remained uncertain because a late frost, excessive rain, or early snow could undo months of work without warning, turning careful planning into loss and leaving households dependent on reserves that were never guaranteed. This uncertainty shaped behavior deeply. People learned to prepare not for the best possible outcome, but for the most likely failure, storing what they could, saving seed even when hungry, and limiting consumption during good years to protect against the next bad one, because memory of scarcity was never distant. Animals, too, were managed under this same logic. Livestock represented stored labor, future food, and insurance against crop failure, yet they also consumed precious fodder during winter, forcing constant calculation about how many could be sustained without threatening the household's survival. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were not kept for abundance, but for balance, providing milk, wool, traction, and manure across the year, while meat remained a secondary benefit, accessed cautiously and often only when survival demanded reduction. Because winter forage was limited, animals were brought indoors during cold months, sharing space with humans not as companions, but as assets whose warmth and survival mattered equally. This shared environment blurred boundaries between human life and animal life, reinforcing a worldview in which survival was collective and vulnerability was shared. Weather shaped movement beyond the household as well. Paths became impassable during heavy snow or rain, isolating farms from one another for weeks at a time, reinforcing self-sufficiency and reducing reliance on external help that might not arrive when needed. Travel, when it occurred, followed seasonal logic, taking place during periods of stable weather and long light, because moving through darkness or cold increased risk without benefit. Even the sea, often imagined as central to Scandinavian life, remained seasonal and local for ordinary people, used cautiously and primarily along familiar coasts, because open water offered no mercy to those without reason or skill to face it. In this environment, time lost its abstract meaning. There were no hours to count, no days marked for celebration or rest beyond what the body required, only cycles of light and dark, warmth and cold, growth and decay, each repeating with slight variation but relentless consistency. People did not expect change because change often meant loss, and stability, however demanding, was preferable to uncertainty. Children grew up internalizing this rhythm without instruction, learning when to work by watching adults respond to light and weather, learning restraint through repetition rather than rule. Elders carried memory of past winters, failed harvests, and near losses, shaping decisions not through authority alone, but through experience that had already proven its value. Every choice, when to plant, when to harvest, when to slaughter, when to travel, was filtered through this accumulated knowledge, because mistakes were not theoretical but remembered physically. In such a world, ambition narrowed naturally. There was little incentive to seek more than what could be defended against climate, and no reward for excess that could not be stored, protected, or sustained through winter. Instead, effort focused on resilience, on building systems that absorbed shock rather than chasing outcomes that required constant success. The land taught this lesson repeatedly, and those who ignored it did not leave stories behind. As seasons continued their cycle without regard for human expectation, life remained bound to preparation rather than progress, shaping a society that valued endurance over expansion and continuity over change. Nothing here moved quickly because speed created exposure and exposure invited failure. This was the environment that ordinary people inhabited every day, not as a challenge to overcome, but as a condition to respect, shaping lives that remained quiet, constrained, and deeply attentive to the world as it actually existed. In this northern world, people did not gather naturally into villages as they would later, not because they lacked social bonds, but because the land itself resisted concentration, forcing households to spread outward across usable ground rather than inward toward one another. Most ordinary people lived on isolated farmsteads, each positioned carefully in relation to arable soil, pasture, water access, and shelter from wind, because survival depended less on proximity to neighbors than on direct control over resources that could not be shared easily without risk. Distance between households was normal, sometimes measured in long walks rather than short paths, creating a landscape where smoke rising from another roof signaled presence without implying closeness, and where silence filled the spaces between farms more often than human voices. These farms were not chosen randomly. Locations reflected generations of trial and error, shaped by observation of flooding patterns, frost pockets, soil depth, and access to seasonal grazing, because once a farm was established, moving it meant abandoning years of accumulated labor embedded in cleared fields, fences, and buildings. Land ownership, where it existed, was tied closely to family lineage, reinforcing stability through inheritance rather than expansion, because dividing land too finely weakened every household involved, while consolidation increased vulnerability to single-point failure. As a result, settlement patterns remained conservative. New farms appeared slowly, often carved from marginal land only when population pressure required it, and even then success was uncertain, with many such attempts eventually abandoned when soil failed to support long-term cultivation. Paths between farms followed the logic of terrain rather than design, winding around stones, wetlands, and slopes, creating routes that changed little over time because altering them offered no practical advantage. These paths served multiple purposes at once. They allowed seasonal movement of animals, limited trade between households, and occasional social contact, but they were never busy because most needs were met within the farm itself, and travel was undertaken only when necessary. Without dense villages, social life organized differently. Community existed, but it was episodic rather than constant, activated during shared labor, seasonal rituals, or crisis, then receding again as households returned to self-contained routines. This arrangement reduced conflict over resources because boundaries were clear and enforced by distance as much as by custom, minimizing disputes that could not be resolved quickly or peacefully. At the same time, isolation increased responsibility. Each farm functioned as a nearly complete unit of production, requiring skills across agriculture, animal care, tool maintenance, food processing, and shelter repair, because relying on external specialists was impractical in a landscape where help might be days away. This necessity shaped people into generalists, capable of performing many tasks adequately rather than mastering one, reinforcing a culture of competence over specialization. The absence of villages also influenced defense and security. There were no walls to retreat behind, no central authority nearby to intervene quickly, meaning that households relied on visibility, familiarity, and deterrence rather than force, trusting that isolation itself reduced the likelihood of conflict. When threats did arise, whether from animals, weather, or human songs, response depended on existing relationships, with nearby farms offering assistance when possible, but never guaranteed. Such networks were informal, based on mutual recognition rather than obligation, because survival demanded cooperation without dependency. Over time, these patterns shaped mental boundaries as much as physical ones. People understood their world in terms of their own land and the few neighboring farms within reach, with distant places remaining abstract and largely irrelevant to daily decision-making. Knowledge traveled slowly, carried by visitors, seasonal movement, or occasional exchange, reinforcing continuity over innovation and preserving established practices even when alternatives existed elsewhere. This slow transmission of change helped stabilize life, but it also limited adaptation, making communities resilient in familiar conditions while vulnerable to unfamiliar pressures. Farmsteads themselves reflected this balance. They were placed close enough to others to allow communication when needed, yet far enough to maintain independence, creating a landscape that appeared empty to outsiders but was deeply inhabited by those who knew where to look. Every clearing, fence line, and grazing area marked human presence layered over generations, even when structures themselves were rebuilt or shifted slightly over time. Nothing here was temporary. Even when materials decayed, the pattern endured, because the land remembered where people had lived and continued to guide where they would live again. In this way, settlement patterns reinforced the broader rhythm of life, favoring repetition over novelty and continuity over expansion, embedding ordinary people deeply within the same spaces their ancestors had already learned to endure. Before the Viking Age gave later centuries their familiar image of large communal halls, ordinary people already lived in long, low buildings that served not as symbols of status or power, but as practical shelters shaped entirely by climate, materials, and the need to survive long winters without interruption. These early longhouses were not designed for ceremony or gathering, but for endurance, stretching horizontally rather than vertically, built close to the ground to resist wind, retain heat, and minimize exposure, because height offered no advantage in a landscape where storms punished anything that stood too boldly against them. Walls were constructed from timber frames filled with wattle, clay, turf, or stone, depending on region and availability, creating thick barriers that slowed the movement of cold air and absorbed moisture unevenly, requiring constant attention rather than admiration. Roofs were heavy and low, often covered with turf or thatch, pressing downward under their own weight, which helped seal the structure against wind while demanding regular maintenance, because neglect allowed water to seep in slowly, rotting beams and weakening the house from within. Inside, space was shared rather than divided. There were few internal walls, not from lack of skill, but from understanding that heat moved best in open areas, and separation wasted warmth that could not be replaced easily once lost. The central hearth dominated the interior, both physically and functionally, providing heat, light, and a place to cook, while smoke rose upward to escape through vents in the roof or simply drifted outward slowly, filling the space before leaving. This smoke was not an accident. It helped preserve timber, deter insects, and dry clothing, even as it irritated eyes and lungs, creating an environment that modern comfort would reject, but which ordinary people accepted as a necessary condition of survival. Floors were made of packed earth, occasionally layered with straw or reeds, absorbing moisture and cold, yet providing a stable surface that could be repaired easily with available materials rather than replaced. Furniture was minimal. Benches, chests, and simple platforms lined the walls, serving multiple purposes depending on time of day, because specialization of objects offered no advantage when space and resources were limited. Beds, where they existed, were low and close to the fire, layered with hides, wool, and straw, emphasizing warmth over softness, because rest depended less on comfort than on the ability to sleep through cold nights without waking repeatedly. Animals shared this space during winter. Cattle, sheep, goats, and sometimes pigs were housed at one end of the longhouse or in an attached section, separated by low partitions rather than walls, their body heat contributing to the overall warmth, while their presence demanded constant management. This arrangement was not sentimental. Animals were valuable, and keeping them alive through winter required protection from cold, predators, and theft, even if it meant tolerating smell, noise, and movement within the same structure. Human life adapted around this reality. Daily routines adjusted to the rhythms of both people and animals, with feeding, cleaning, and maintenance woven into the same space where meals were eaten and rest was taken. Privacy, as later understood, did not exist. Instead, proximity became normal, and awareness of others' movements formed part of the background of life, reducing isolation even as farms remained physically separate from one another. Light inside the house was limited. Fire provided illumination unevenly, casting shadows that shifted with movement, while daylight entered only through small openings designed to reduce heat loss rather than invite brightness. As a result, interior life moved slowly, guided by what could be seen rather than by clocks or schedules, reinforcing patience and repetition. Houses were not static. They required constant repair, adjustment, and renewal, because materials decayed under moisture, smoke, and use, and every household understood that neglect accumulated quickly into failure. Roofs were patched, walls reinforced, floors repacked, and hearths cleaned regularly, often as part of seasonal routines rather than emergency response. This labor bound people to their homes not emotionally but practically. The house represented stored effort, years of work embedded in structure, making abandonment a serious decision taken only when conditions made continuation impossible. Even then, new houses followed familiar patterns, rebuilt nearby or on similar ground, because deviation offered little benefit and significant risk. In this way, early longhouses functioned as extensions of the landscape itself, shaped by the same constraints and cycles, reinforcing a life lived close to ground, fire, animals, and weather. They were not places of ambition or display, but tools of survival, quietly enduring through repetition, repair, and use, generation after generation, without expectation of improvement beyond what experience had already proven necessary. Within these farmsteads and longhouses, the household was not simply a place where people lived together, but the primary structure through which all labor, responsibility, and survival were organized, because there was no meaningful separation between domestic life and economic life in a world where everything depended on collective effort. A household usually included several generations living under the same roof, not out of tradition alone, but because separation weakened everyone involved, dividing labor, knowledge, and resources in ways that made survival more fragile rather than more efficient. Older members remained integrated into daily life for as long as their bodies allowed, contributing experience, memory, and guidance even when physical strength declined, because knowledge of seasons, soil, animals, and past failures carried practical value that could not be replaced. Adults formed the core of labor, responsible for the heaviest and most continuous work, yet their roles were not rigidly specialized, because flexibility mattered more than mastery in an environment where unexpected conditions regularly disrupted plans. Men and women both worked continuously, though tasks often followed customary divisions shaped by strength, proximity, and rhythm rather than ideology, with outdoor labor, heavy lifting, and long-distance movement tending toward men, while food processing, textile work, and household maintenance often centered on women, though these boundaries shifted whenever necessity required it. Children were included early. From a young age, they learned by watching and imitating rather than by instruction, gradually taking on simple tasks that increased in complexity as their bodies allowed, because delaying involvement wasted potential labor and risked leaving skills undeveloped when they would be needed most. There was no concept of childhood as a protected phase separate from responsibility. Instead, participation created belonging, and belonging reinforced obligation, binding each individual into the household's survival system long before personal preference could matter. Work followed a continuous rhythm rather than a schedule. Tasks overlapped and blended, with feeding animals, repairing tools, preparing food, and tending fields occurring alongside one another as conditions allowed, because efficiency depended on responding to immediate needs rather than adhering to fixed routines. This created a form of labor that felt constant but rarely frantic, paced by daylight, weather, and physical endurance rather than external demands. Rest existed, but it was functional rather than recreational. Periods of reduced activity occurred when weather limited movement or darkness constrained visibility. Yet even then, lighter tasks filled the time, such as repairing clothing, maintaining equipment, or preparing materials for future use. Idleness, as a concept, had little place here. If something could be done now to reduce effort later, it usually was, because postponement carried risk. Authority within the household followed experience and ownership rather than formal hierarchy. Decisions about planting, slaughtering, travel, or resource use were typically guided by those who held memory of past outcomes, reinforcing respect for elders not through ideology, but through demonstrated reliability. Conflict, when it arose, was resolved internally whenever possible, because division weakened the unit and invited external pressure that could not be controlled. Labor itself reinforced social bonds. Shared effort created shared responsibility, and failure affected everyone equally, reducing incentive for individual defiance and encouraging cooperation even when tensions existed. This collective orientation did not eliminate disagreement, but it framed it within survival rather than self-expression. Tools and resources belonged to the household rather than the individual. Ownership was practical, defined by use and maintenance rather than by personal claim, because hoarding undermined efficiency and invited resentment that could destabilize cooperation. When tools broke, repair became a shared concern, and when animals fell ill, their care affected everyone's workload. Over time, this structure produced a worldview centered on continuity rather than advancement. People measured success by the household's ability to persist from one season to the next without catastrophic loss, not by accumulation or distinction beyond what was necessary to ensure stability. Ambition expressed itself quietly through careful preparation, prudent decisions, and avoidance of unnecessary risk. The household thus functioned as both economic engine and social anchor, absorbing shock, distributing labor, and transmitting knowledge across generations without formal instruction or written record. It was within this structure that ordinary people lived most of their lives, not seeking change, but managing repetition, not chasing opportunity, but defending equilibrium. In such a system, individuality existed, but it was secondary to function, shaped and constrained by the needs of the whole, because survival here depended less on who someone was and more on what they contributed, day after day, season after season, without expectation of recognition beyond continued belonging. Daily life in pre-Viking Scandinavia unfolded according to light rather than clocks, because in a world without artificial illumination beyond fire, visibility defined what could be done, when it could begin, and how long it could continue, making daylight not just a convenience, but the primary regulator of human activity. The day began early, often before full sunrise, as people responded to the gradual return of light rather than a fixed hour, rising when the interior of the house became visible enough to move safely, tend animals, and prepare the first tasks without wasting precious daylight. Morning carried urgency, not in the sense of haste, but in priority. Animals needed feeding before work elsewhere could begin. Fires had to be rekindled for warmth and cooking, and simple food was prepared quickly because energy spent early shaped the effectiveness of the entire day. Meals in the morning were functional and brief, intended to sustain labor rather than provide comfort, since prolonged eating delayed work and consumed daylight that could not be recovered later. Once the light strengthened, work expanded outward. Fields, fences, paths, and shoreline activities drew people away from the house, spreading labor across the surrounding landscape in patterns shaped by season, weather, and immediate necessity rather than long-term planning. During the brighter months, especially in summer, the extended daylight allowed work to continue for long, uninterrupted stretches, creating days that felt expansive and physically demanding, yet also offered rare opportunities to accomplish tasks that could not be attempted during darker periods. In contrast, winter compressed life inward. Short daylight hours forced a strict prioritization of tasks, with only the most essential outdoor labor completed before darkness returned, while indoor work filled the remaining time, reshaping daily rhythm into a slower, quieter pattern centered around the hearth. Midday did not mark rest in a modern sense. Instead, it represented a moment when labor shifted slightly, with brief pauses to eat, drink, or adjust tools, but rarely long enough to interrupt momentum, because stopping entirely risked wasting light that might be needed later for unexpected demands. Fatigue was managed through pacing rather than rest. People learned to distribute effort across the day, adjusting intensity based on physical limits and environmental conditions, because exhaustion carried consequences that extended beyond discomfort, increasing the risk of injury or error in tasks that required precision. As daylight faded, activity contracted. Outdoor work ended first, followed by tasks requiring fine visibility, leaving only those activities that could be completed by firelight, such as repairing tools, processing fibers, or preparing food for the following day. Evenings were subdued. Conversation occurred, but quietly, shaped by proximity to the fire and the awareness that energy would be needed again at first light, discouraging prolonged activity that served no immediate purpose. Night brought enforced rest. Without light, movement became hazardous, and the cold intensified once fires diminished, making sleep not only necessary but unavoidable, as the body conserved energy for the following day. This rhythm repeated with remarkable consistency. Days differed in content but not in structure, reinforcing a sense of predictability that anchored life even amid uncertainty. Because while harvests could fail and weather could shift, the pattern of light and darkness remained constant. Over time, this light-driven routine shaped perception itself. Time was experienced as flow rather than measurement, marked by visible change rather than counted intervals, with memory organized around seasons, tasks, and outcomes instead of dates. The body adapted. Sleep aligned with darkness, work aligned with light, and awareness aligned with immediate surroundings, producing a form of existence deeply attuned to environmental cues rather than abstract schedules. In this way, daily rhythm became more than habit. It formed the foundation upon which all other aspects of life rested, quietly reinforcing discipline, endurance, and acceptance of limitation. Because in a northern world governed by light, survival depended less on control and more on alignment. Farming in pre-Viking Scandinavia was not an act of abundance, but an ongoing negotiation with land that resisted easy use, because thin soils, stone-filled fields, short growing seasons, and unpredictable weather meant that agriculture existed under constant pressure rather than stable expectation. Fields were small, not by preference but by necessity. Arable land had to be cleared from forest and stone, often by hand, and every usable patch represented accumulated labor across generations, making expansion slow, cautious, and limited by what the household could realistically maintain. Barley dominated because it matured quickly and tolerated cooler conditions, while oats and rye appeared where soil and climate allowed, creating a patchwork of cultivation rather than uniform fields, with each plot reflecting local adaptation rather than standardized planning. Crop failure was not exceptional. It was expected often enough that farming decisions prioritized reliability over yield, favoring methods that reduced total loss even if they limited potential surplus, because survival depended on consistency rather than success in any single year. Soil fertility required constant attention. Manure from livestock was carefully collected and spread, ash from hearth fires reused, and fields rested when possible, though rest was itself a risk when food reserves were limited, forcing families to balance long-term soil health against immediate hunger. Plowing was shallow. Wooden plows with iron tips scratched rather than turned the soil, constrained by stone and root, producing modest results, but minimizing tool damage, which mattered when iron was valuable and replacement uncertain. Work followed a strict seasonal sequence. Spring demanded rapid preparation and sowing before warmth faded. Summer required maintenance and vigilance against weeds and animals, and autumn compressed harvesting into narrow windows dictated by weather, where delay could destroy months of effort in days. Labor was collective. Men, women, children, and elders all contributed according to ability, because the scale of work exceeded what any individual could manage, and survival depended on coordinated effort rather than specialized roles. Children learned farming by participation, not instruction. Tasks began small and grew with age, embedding knowledge physically rather than verbally, until skill became instinctive and mistakes costly enough to be avoided through habit. Animals played a central role. Oxen provided traction where available, while livestock manure sustained soil, linking animal care directly to crop success, making farming a system rather than a single activity. Weather remained the ultimate authority. Rain could arrive too early or too late, frost could cut growth short, and storms could flatten fields without warning, reminding farmers that effort did not guarantee outcome, only possibility. Harvest carried tension. Grain had to be cut, dried, stored, and protected from moisture and pests, with each step presenting its own risk, because loss after harvest could be as devastating as failure in the field. Storage pits and structures reflected experience. Designs evolved to reduce spoilage, yet no method was perfect, reinforcing caution and restraint in consumption, especially as winter approached. Farming under these conditions shaped mentality. It discouraged optimism and punished waste, fostering habits of careful calculation and restrained expectation, because abundance was temporary and scarcity recurring. Over generations, this pressure produced resilience rather than progress. Innovation occurred slowly, tested harshly by environment, adopted only when proven reliable, because experimentation carried costs few could afford. In this way, agriculture defined more than food. It shaped time, labor, family structure, and worldview, embedding survival into daily action and reinforcing a culture where persistence mattered more than improvement and endurance outweighed ambition. In pre-Viking Scandinavia, livestock represented security more than consumption because animals embodied stored labor, future sustenance, and social stability in a landscape where grain alone could not guarantee survival. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs formed the core of household wealth, not as symbols of prosperity, but as living systems that converted marginal land into usable resources through milk, wool, traction, manure, and only occasionally meat. Milk mattered more than flesh. Dairy products provided renewable nourishment throughout the year, allowing families to extract value repeatedly from the same animal, which was crucial in an environment where killing livestock too early could undermine long-term survival. Sheep supplied wool. Wool production shaped daily routines through spinning, weaving, and repair, embedding textile labor into household life and transforming animal care into clothing, insulation, and protection against cold rather than luxury. Cattle offered traction. Oxen enabled plowing where human strength alone was insufficient, linking animal health directly to agricultural success, because a weakened animal reduced field productivity long before hunger became visible. Pigs occupied a different role. They converted waste and forest resources into food efficiently, requiring less pasture, making them suitable for woodland environments where grazing land was limited. Animals were overwintered indoors. Longhouses often housed people and livestock under the same roof, separated by low partitions, not from sentiment but necessity, because shared warmth reduced fuel consumption and improved survival odds during extended cold periods. This proximity shaped daily experience. The sounds, smells, and movements of animals were constant, merging human and animal rhythms into a single domestic environment where care never fully paused. Winter fodder determined survival. Hay, straw, and stored feed had to last until spring, making miscalculation fatal because starvation weakened animals first, reducing milk production and fertility before death followed. Slaughter followed logic, not appetite. Animals were killed when necessary or when winter resources could no longer support them, often seasonally, preserving meat through drying or smoking while avoiding unnecessary loss of breeding stock. Livestock loss carried consequences beyond hunger. It reduced manure supply, weakened fields, and diminished future production, creating cascading effects that could persist across years rather than seasons. Disease and injury posed constant threats. Veterinary knowledge was limited, relying on observation and experience rather than intervention, making prevention through careful management more important than treatment. Ownership defined status. While wealth differences existed, they were measured in animals rather than objects, and livestock counts influenced marriage prospects, inheritance, and social standing within local networks. Animals required daily attention, feeding, cleaning, milking, and monitoring integrated into routine, reinforcing the idea that wealth demanded labor rather than passive possession. Children learned animal care early. Responsibilities grew with age, embedding knowledge physically and emotionally, because mistakes carried immediate consequences, visible in animal health. Through livestock, households connected land, labor, and time. Animals transformed seasons into cycles of dependency and renewal, reinforcing cautious planning and long-term thinking rather than immediate gain. In this system, wealth was fragile. It lived, aged, reproduced, and died, demanding constant engagement and reminding people that security depended on care, restraint, and continuity rather than accumulation. Food in pre-Viking Scandinavia was governed by necessity rather than preference, because daily meals existed to sustain labor and survive winter rather than to provide variety, pleasure, or abundance. Grain formed the foundation. Barley porridge, coarse bread, and simple gruels appeared repeatedly, day after day, because grain stored well, could be stretched with water, and delivered predictable energy in a climate where calories mattered more than taste. Meals were repetitive by design. Repetition reduced risk, simplified preparation, and allowed households to plan consumption carefully, because novelty consumed resources and increased uncertainty. Dairy products softened scarcity. Milk, butter, curds, and early forms of cheese added fat and protein, extending the usefulness of livestock without reducing herd size, which mattered more than occasional indulgence. Meat was rare. Animals were too valuable alive to be eaten regularly, making meat consumption seasonal, strategic, and often linked to slaughter decisions rather than appetite, reinforcing restraint rather than abundance. Fish supplemented diets where geography allowed. Coastal and river communities relied on fishing and shellfish to reduce pressure on livestock and fields, drying or smoking catches to extend availability beyond immediate consumption. Wild plants filled gaps. Berries, nuts, roots, and leafy greens added nutrients when available, but foraging complemented rather than replaced agriculture because yields were unpredictable and seasonal. Food preparation was simple. Cooking focused on boiling, baking on hot stone, and slow heating over the hearth, methods that conserved fuel and reduced waste while fitting the constraints of available tools. Salt was limited. Preservation relied on drying, smoking, and fermentation rather than heavy salting, shaping flavors that were functional rather than refined. Storage defined survival. Grain pits, wooden containers, and elevated storage structures protected food from moisture and pests, yet no method was fully secure, making vigilance constant and consumption cautious. Meals were communal. Household members ate from shared vessels, reinforcing equality within family units while limiting portion excess, because shared access discouraged overconsumption. Timing mattered. Meals aligned with work cycles, often brief and functional, minimizing interruption during daylight hours when labor productivity mattered most. Hunger was familiar. Even well-managed households experienced lean periods, particularly late winter, when reserves dwindled and new growth remained distant, making restraint habitual rather than exceptional. Food scarcity shaped behavior. Waste became unacceptable, leftovers reused, and portions adjusted according to age and labor contribution, embedding hierarchy subtly into daily nourishment. Children learned limits early. They observed adults rationing food and internalized caution, developing habits that prioritized survival over satisfaction. Food carried memory. Recipes remained stable across generations because change risked failure, reinforcing continuity and discouraging experimentation in everyday nourishment. Through food, people learned patience. Eating was not an event, but a maintenance task, repeated quietly, reinforcing a worldview where sustenance supported work rather than defined pleasure. In this way, daily meals reflected the broader structure of life, predictable, restrained, and shaped by environment. Food sustained bodies while teaching discipline, endurance, and respect for limits imposed by land and season. Clothing in pre-Viking Scandinavia reflected necessity rather than identity, because garments existed to protect the body from cold, moisture, and labor, rather than to express individuality or status in any visible or dramatic way. Wool dominated everyday wear. Sheep provided a reliable source of fiber that retained warmth even when damp, making wool essential in a climate where rain, snow, and cold were constant threats rather than seasonal exceptions. Linen appeared less frequently. Where flax could be grown and processed, linen offered lighter fabric for underlayers or warmer months, but its production required labor and conditions that limited its availability, keeping it secondary to wool. Garments were layered. Multiple thin layers trapped air and allowed adjustment to changing conditions throughout the day, reflecting practical adaptation rather than stylistic choice. Cuts were simple. Clothing followed basic shapes that minimized waste during production and simplified repair, because complex tailoring increased material loss and demanded specialized skill. Repair mattered more than replacement. Garments were patched repeatedly, seams reinforced, and worn areas strengthened, extending usability across years and even generations, making clothing a long-term investment rather than disposable property. Footwear was fragile. Shoes made from leather or simple hides wore out quickly in wet and uneven terrain, requiring frequent maintenance or replacement, which made walking itself a material concern rather than a casual act. Personal belongings were few. Most people owned limited sets of clothing, often designated for work and for rest, reinforcing habits of care and restraint in daily use. Color existed but remained subdued. Dyes derived from plants and minerals produced muted tones rather than bright hues, and darker colors were valued for their ability to conceal wear and dirt. Clothing communicated status indirectly. Quality of material, cleanliness, and condition mattered more than ornamentation, because visible excess risked social tension and wasted resources. Women carried much of the textile labor. Spinning, weaving, washing, and repair integrated into daily routine, transforming fiber into clothing through continuous, repetitive work rather than isolated production periods. Textile tools were simple but essential. Spindles, looms, and needles appeared in nearly every household, embedding clothing production directly into domestic space. Children learned textile skills early. Small tasks introduced gradually built familiarity with materials and technique, ensuring continuity of knowledge without formal instruction. Season dictated clothing use. Heavier garments dominated winter, while lighter layers appeared in summer, but no season allowed comfort without attention to weather and activity. Cleanliness was functional. Clothing removed dirt and moisture rather than pursued freshness because fuel and water were limited and labor-intensive to access. Through clothing, people experienced constraint. Garments restricted movement slightly, retained smells of smoke and animals, and reminded wearers constantly of their environment, reinforcing awareness rather than insulation from hardship. Material life was intimate. Clothing touched skin continuously, carried traces of labor, and aged alongside its wearer, becoming part of personal history rather than a temporary covering. In this way, clothing embodied survival. It protected, endured, and demanded care, reinforcing values of maintenance, patience, and continuity rather than expression or display. Tools in pre-Viking Scandinavia were not separate from daily life, but woven directly into it, because nearly every task depended on simple implements whose presence was constant and whose absence could halt work entirely. Most tools were made and maintained at the household level. Woodworking dominated production, as wood was abundant and adaptable, shaping handles, frames, containers, sleds, and structural elements through skills passed down by observation rather than instruction. Iron existed, but it was valuable. Metal tools were reused, repaired, and protected carefully, because smelting and forging required specialized knowledge and resources, making iron objects assets rather than conveniences. A single iron blade might serve multiple purposes. Knives functioned as tools for food preparation, craft, repair, and daily tasks, becoming extensions of the hand rather than specialized instruments. Craft production followed necessity. Objects were made to solve immediate problems rather than to accumulate surplus, reinforcing a mindset where usefulness outweighed refinement. Spinning and weaving occurred continuously. Textile production did not happen in isolated periods, but filled pauses between other tasks, making craft labor flexible and constant rather than scheduled. Pottery and containers reflected function. Vessels were shaped for storage, cooking, and transport, with minimal decoration because durability mattered more than appearance. Repair defined skill. Broken tools were fixed, cracked handles reinforced, and worn edges reshaped, extending lifespan and reducing dependence on external exchange. Craft circulated locally. Techniques spread slowly through family networks and neighboring farms, creating regional variation rather than uniform standards. Children learned by proximity. Watching adults work and assisting with minor tasks embedded technique into muscle memory long before formal responsibility appeared. Time shaped production. Winter months increased indoor craft activity, while summer reduced it, aligning making with seasonal availability rather than demand. Waste was minimized. Materials were reused until exhausted, and byproducts fed into other processes, reinforcing efficiency born of necessity rather than environmental awareness. Ownership was personal. Tools were often associated with specific individuals, cared for attentively, and passed down when possible, embedding identity into material objects. Craft reinforced independence. Households that could maintain their own tools reduced vulnerability, reinforcing self-sufficiency as a survival strategy rather than an ideological choice. Through tools and craft, people controlled small portions of their environment. They shaped wood, fiber, and metal enough to endure, but not enough to dominate, maintaining balance between effort and outcome. Production did not aim for progress, it aimed for continuity, ensuring that tomorrow resembled yesterday closely enough to remain manageable. In this way, everyday craft anchored life. It filled quiet hours, reinforced skill, and sustained households through repetition rather than innovation, creating stability in a world defined by limits. Trade in pre-Viking Scandinavia existed quietly and unevenly because most ordinary people lived within narrow geographic ranges where daily needs were met locally and long-distance exchange remained indirect, infrequent, and largely invisible to everyday life. There was no market economy in the modern sense. Exchange occurred through personal networks, seasonal encounters, and occasional gatherings, rather than permanent trading centers, making trade an extension of social relationships rather than a separate activity. Most households produced what they used. Food, clothing, tools, and containers came from within the farmstead or immediate surroundings, reducing dependence on exchange and limiting the volume of goods that moved between communities. When exchange happened, it was practical. Surplus grain, animal products, hides, wool, and crafted items moved short distances to meet specific needs, rather than to generate profit, reinforcing balance rather than accumulation. Barter dominated. Goods were exchanged directly, valued for usefulness rather than abstract worth, because coinage held little meaning for common people whose lives were governed by subsistence rather than surplus. Certain materials traveled farther. Amber, iron, and furs moved through layered networks where items passed from hand to hand across regions, gradually bridging distances without direct contact between producers and distant consumers. Roman goods arrived slowly. Glass, coins, metal objects, and ornaments reached Scandinavia through intermediaries, appearing rarely and unevenly, marking prestige rather than practicality, and remaining outside ordinary daily use. These objects did not transform life. They were incorporated cautiously, valued for durability or symbolism rather than novelty, because unfamiliar materials carried risk and replacement was uncertain. Poor roads, harsh terrain, and seasonal constraints discouraged movement, confining most people to familiar landscapes and reinforcing local knowledge over exploration. Trade routes followed natural paths. Rivers, coastlines, and established trails shaped movement, reducing unpredictability and reinforcing patterns that repeated across generations. Trust mattered more than reach. Exchange relied on reputation and familiarity rather than contracts, because enforcement mechanisms were minimal and loss could be devastating. Children observed exchange early. They learned value through watching adults negotiate, trade, and assess goods, absorbing judgment skills informally rather than through instruction. Trade carried social weight. Accepting goods created obligations, reinforcing reciprocity and long-term relationships rather than immediate balance. Scarcity shaped caution. Households avoided overcommitting resources, preferring stability to risk, which limited expansion and slowed economic change. Innovation moved through trade slowly. New tools or materials appeared only after prolonged exposure and testing, because failure carried consequences beyond inconvenience. Through this restrained exchange, communities remained connected yet self-contained. Trade linked households without dissolving their independence, reinforcing a world where contact existed but transformation remained rare. In this way, pre-Viking trade preserved continuity. It allowed limited flow without disruption, ensuring that ordinary life remained anchored in land, labor, and familiarity rather than distant opportunity. Belief in pre-Viking Scandinavia was not organized around dramatic worship or daily devotion to named gods, but around continuity, protection, and the maintenance of balance between household, land, and unseen forces that were felt rather than described. Religion, as later sources portray it, did not structure daily life for ordinary people. Instead, belief existed as a layer of caution and respect embedded into routine actions, seasonal timing, and family memory, shaping behavior quietly rather than commanding attention. The household stood at the center. Archaeological evidence suggests that ritual activity focused on the farmstead itself, where offerings, symbols, and practices reinforced connection to ancestors and land, rather than distant deities. Ancestors mattered more than gods. The dead represented continuity, lineage, and legitimacy of land use, making remembrance a practical concern tied to inheritance and identity rather than abstract spirituality. Burials reflected restraint. Most graves contained modest goods, indicating concern for the deceased without extravagance, reinforcing the idea that belief emphasized care and respect rather than display. Ritual followed seasons. Key moments aligned with planting, harvest, winter survival, and renewal, marking transitions that mattered materially rather than commemorating mythic events. These practices were simple. Offerings of food, tools, or small objects acknowledged dependence on forces beyond control, without elaborate ceremony or hierarchy. No priestly class dominated daily belief. Ritual knowledge passed through families, embedded in habit and memory, rather than codified doctrine, making belief adaptable and locally specific. Fear existed, but it was restrained. Illness, crop failure, And death prompted cautious behavior rather than panic, reinforcing rituals designed to prevent misfortune rather than explain it. Sacred and ordinary were not separated. Daily tasks carried meaning through repetition, reinforcing respect for land and life cycles without requiring explicit ritual action. Silence mattered. Belief did not demand constant affirmation, allowing long stretches of life to pass without overt expression, reinforcing calm rather than anxiety. Children absorbed belief passively. They observed gestures, timing, and restraint, learning when to act carefully rather than why, embedding belief into behavior rather than language. Change was slow. Practices persisted because they aligned with survival, and those that failed quietly disappeared without record, leaving belief shaped by selection rather than doctrine. This form of belief discouraged excess. It did not promise reward or transformation, but stability and protection, aligning with a worldview where endurance mattered more than meaning. Through restrained ritual, households maintained continuity. Belief supported life rather than defined it, remaining present but unobtrusive, reinforcing a culture where survival and respect outweighed expression and myth. Illness and injury in pre-Viking Scandinavia were constant presences rather than exceptional events, because daily life involved physical labor, close contact with animals, smoke-filled interiors, and limited medical knowledge, all of which increased vulnerability without offering reliable means of treatment. The body was always at risk. Cuts, burns, broken bones, and infections emerged from ordinary tasks such as farming, woodworking, animal care, and food preparation, making danger inseparable from work rather than tied to unusual circumstances. Medical understanding was practical and limited. Herbal remedies, poultices, and basic procedures relied on observation and experience rather than theory, offering relief in some cases but rarely guaranteeing recovery. Infection posed the greatest threat. Without knowledge of bacteria or antiseptics, minor wounds could worsen quickly, turning routine injuries into life-threatening conditions, especially during colder months when healing slowed. Pain was endured rather than eliminated. There is little evidence of systematic pain management, making suffering a familiar aspect of life rather than a temporary interruption. Child mortality was high. Many children did not survive early years due to illness, malnutrition, or accidents, shaping family expectations and reinforcing emotional restraint as a survival response rather than indifference. Women faced additional risks. Pregnancy and childbirth carried significant danger, and survival depended on experience, communal support, and luck rather than medical intervention. Elders lived with accumulated injury. Those who survived into older age often bore marks of physical strain, arthritis, and reduced mobility, yet remained integrated into household life rather than isolated. Disease moved quietly. Illness spread within households and between nearby farms, constrained by low population density but intensified by shared living spaces and seasonal confinement indoors. Healing was slow. Recovery required rest, which reduced labor capacity and increased pressure on others, reinforcing the interconnectedness of household survival. Death was familiar. Loss occurred often enough that it became integrated into life, rather than treated as an extraordinary rupture, shaping attitudes toward time, attachment, and expectation. Burial practices reflected acceptance. Most individuals were laid to rest with modest care, reinforcing respect without excess and acknowledging death as part of continuity rather than disruption. Grief was present but contained. Survival demanded continuation of work, limiting the space available for prolonged mourning and reinforcing resilience through necessity rather than suppression. Life expectancy was low by modern standards. Few could assume long life, shaping decisions around labor, reproduction, and inheritance without expectation of extended time. Illness and mortality reinforced caution. They discouraged risk-taking and encouraged adherence to proven practices, because deviation carried consequences that extended beyond the individual. Through constant exposure to vulnerability, people developed endurance. Suffering did not dominate thought, but it informed behavior quietly, reinforcing awareness of limits and the value of stability. In this environment, survival was achievement enough. Health was not expected, only hoped for, and life continued forward through acceptance rather than control. Life in pre-Viking Scandinavia did not move toward a goal, because for ordinary people, the purpose of existence was not progress, expansion, or transformation, but the careful preservation of what already worked well enough to survive another season. Days repeated themselves, not exactly the same, but close enough that memory blended them together, forming patterns rather than events, where meaning came from continuation rather than difference. Generations lived within the same rhythms. Children grew into the same labor their parents once performed. Elders passed down knowledge through action rather than instruction, and households adapted slowly, adjusting details while preserving structure. Innovation arrived cautiously. New tools, methods, or materials were tested over time, absorbed only when they proved reliable, because failure carried consequences that could last years rather than moments. Stability was valued over improvement. Risk threatened survival, and ambition consumed resources, making restraint a rational response rather than a lack of imagination. The land remained constant. Fields were worked repeatedly, forests provided material carefully, and animals followed seasonal cycles that shaped human behavior more than intention. Light defined time. Long summer days compressed labor into brief seasons of effort, while winter darkness slowed life, pulling activity inward and reinforcing dependence on stored resources and shared space. Households functioned as systems. Each person contributed according to ability, age, and experience, creating balance through coordination rather than equality, because survival required cooperation more than fairness. Memory mattered, not written memory, but practical memory embedded in habit, guiding decisions without reflection, ensuring that mistakes were not repeated and successful patterns endured. Belief supported continuity. Ritual, restraint, and respect reinforced caution, helping households navigate uncertainty without demanding explanation or promise of reward. Death did not interrupt life. It marked transition rather than ending, because work continued, fields required tending, and animals needed care, pulling attention back to the present. Change arrived quietly. Gradual shifts in climate, trade, and technique accumulated slowly, unnoticed in daily routine, altering life over generations rather than moments. No one expected what would come later. The people of this world did not anticipate raids, ships, or expansion because their lives were shaped entirely by immediate concerns rather than distant possibilities. They lived within limits, limits of land, light, body, and season, accepting constraint as normal and adapting through patience rather than resistance. In the evenings, the world narrowed. Firelight softened edges, animals settled, tools rested, and voices grew quiet, marking the end of effort without ceremony. Sleep followed naturally, not as escape, but as part of the cycle, preparing bodies to repeat what had already proven necessary. This world did not seek to be remembered, it existed to continue, and in that continuation, ordinary people shaped the foundation upon which later change would stand, without knowing it, without naming it, and without ever needing to imagine something else. The cycle closed, the land remained, and life, quiet and unremarkable, moved forward once more.